All right, and we are live. As always, coming from my basement. Someday we'll be able to do events back in the store. Even virtual events will be surrounded by books someday. So, but this is a little bit easier for those of us who don't have to be in the store at 7 o'clock. So, all right. So I am Amber from One More Page Books. I'm glad everybody is tuning in this evening. Kind of talk for just a second as a few more people log in. I know people are wondering when we're reopening. We are working on it, so stay tuned. Hoping we'll have some dates to announce pretty soon. All right. And for now, I'm going to start. See, the nice thing about being able to do virtual events, of course, is that we get to bring people from all over the place together. The bad thing is, we don't get to get our books signed, meet our authors, actually have fun conversations. But I'm glad we get to reach out farther than just Arlington and Falls Church. So thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm going to do a super quick housekeeping and then introduction, and then I'm going to hand things over to tonight's authors for their discussion. Anyone who would like to comment or ask a question, if you're on Facebook, you do that in the comments, and if you're on YouTube, you do that in the chat function versus the comments. So we will see everything coming in, and we will get to questions later in the hour. But first, I want to welcome tonight's authors. Nathan Bomey's book, Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age, was released last week, although we're still waiting to get it in the store, the little shipping problems or something. Nathan is a reporter for USA Today and is the author of two other books, Detroit Resurrected and After the Fact. He's a regular guest on TV and radio networks, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and others. And Amanda Ripley's latest book, High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out, was released last month. She's a New York Times bestselling author of The Smartest Kids in the World and The Unthinkable. She writes for The Atlantic, Politico, Washington Post, New York Times, and others. And I am going to pop up a couple comments during the event with links to where you folks can get their books. They will be signing books as soon as we have them in the store. And I'm going to hand things over for the conversation tonight. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, cool. Hey, thanks, Amber. And I'm just excited to be here with Amanda. And yeah, encourage you to buy signed copies of both books. Honestly, I think Amanda's might be better than mine. So if you buy one,
they're a great package deal. They're a great package.
What's funny about this, though, is that we were both working on these books for years without realizing that the other person was doing something that was in similar territory. And so I don't know if that makes us bad journalists or good journalists because we, we're keeping our sources secret or something. But what Amanda and I discussed was that we would kind of interview each other here because we have some similar perspectives and I'm sure some different perspectives as well on some of the issues that we face. And just to give you a little introduction to myself, then I'll kick it over to Amanda. I am a reporter at USA Today. I've been there for just about 6 years now. And before that, I was a reporter at the Detroit Free Press. I've written a couple books, like Amber mentioned. This is my third book, and it actually stems from my second. It actually builds on the second book, which was about the age of misinformation and why people believe things that aren't true and how the conditions for Donald Trump to rise to the White House were in place and that he didn't necessarily set those conditions in motion, that he sort of capitalized on it. But I walked away from that book with the very visceral sense that, we are so terribly immersed in this crisis of toxic polarization that what can we actually do about it? And it felt pretty depressing. And I said to myself, I have to meet people who are not accepting the status quo. I've got to go out and meet people who are trying to bring other people together despite their differences, whether it's race, religion, class, or culture. I have to go out and meet these people. And so that's what I did. I mean, actually, long before I had a book deal, I started to go, this is before COVID, visiting people, interviewing people, and trying to discern lessons from them. And so that's a little bit what we're going to talk about today. And I have to tell you, I finished Amanda's book last weekend, and just incredibly compelling and really closely aligned with my own perspective on how we address these unbelievably challenging issues. So I'll kick it over to you.
Cool. Thank you, Nathan. It's great to be here with you. And thank you to Amber and to One More Page Books for doing this, and all of you for being here. I am so curious because, we have two different journalists who don't know each other, and both are totally dispirited by the state of political conflict in the country, and both go off in separate directions in most cases and write a book about it. And the books are different in ways that we'll talk about. But I have a lot of questions actually for Nathan about decisions I made, decisions that maybe I didn't make the right decision on, things that came up in the process of reporting that usually have no one really to bounce those ideas off of. So in my own case, about 4 years ago, I sort of realized that I had to do something differently as a journalist, or I was just going to make the conflict worse, even if I didn't intend to, right? But I didn't know what that was, like how to do this differently. There's a sort of formula for covering conflict, and it is broken. It doesn't work in a hyperpolarized situation, and often backfires, right? So I went off and started hanging out with people who study intractable conflict all over the world. And I realized that looking at these problems through the lens of conflict is hugely insightful. Like everything starts making sense again in a weird way, particularly when you look at intractable conflicts and how they operate. But then, like Nathan, I really wanted to find examples of people doing something differently. I think in journalism, we're pretty good at describing the problem and lamenting it, bemoaning it, blaming people for it, all kinds of stories around the problem. And that is super important. But I find there's a total lack of stories about people trying to solve problems in their communities, even if those attempts don't work. I mean, that's still really interesting. And I think there's a real hunger for that in audiences that, you can just start to feel overwhelmed by your newsfeed at a certain point. So what does it look like to do something differently? So I followed people who were at some point stuck in really difficult conflicts. A politician in California, a gang leader in Chicago, regular frustrated Democrats in New York City, and regular frustrated Democrats in Michigan. All kinds of people who had shifted from dysfunctional, toxic conflict of one kind or another, personal or political, into what I call good conflict, which is healthy, constructive, can be stressful and heated, but is really important for our society. And we need more good conflict, not less. So trying to track, what did they do first, second, and third? What do they have in common? How can the rest of us help that process along if we so desire? So that's what High Conflict is about. I do think I'm serious when I say they're a good package, because your book is looking at it, I think, a little bit more head on, like what is the problem? What are the solutions? And looking across a whole bunch of different attempts, not just three, all over the world, actually. So I like that about it, that it's not stovepiped in one place or one kind of conflict. Like a lot of these books tend to be just very focused on one example. So should I kick it off with a question, or do you want to start first?
Go for it. And I love the fact that both as journalists, as classic journalists, we haven't told each other what we're going to ask. So, honestly, this is completely, who knows what's going to happen here.
This could be a gotcha question. This could all be a setup.
I know, then I will have to kind of like de-escalate the conflict here.
Right, in real time.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I do feel like in some ways being a traditional print journalist in this moment and deciding to go off and do a book like this is a little bit countercultural. Do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think you did it? I mean, in some ways, it's easier to just kind of double down on the kind of journalism that is normally happening. And it's hard to make stories about, bridging organizations kind of come to life. I think you've done that, but it's easier to do something else, right? To just keep covering the problem.
Yeah, well, no, you're right. And actually, I agree wholeheartedly with what you said earlier. And it's actually sort of fundamental to why I did it as well, which is I do feel like we as journalists can't have a conversation about the problem without at least training the lens on ourselves a little bit and saying, what can we do, or to what extent have we been a part of the problem? And I will defend all day journalism from false accusations of fake news that we've endured for the last several years, and because ultimately sound journalism is critical to a healthy democracy. That said, I also think that we have to look at how we have sometimes trended a little bit too sensationalistic, a little bit too far in service of clicks, and that ultimately compromises our relationship with our readers. Because if readers or viewers don't, they're smart, they'll see that the story is being stretched just a little bit too much, and over time, I think that starts to add up and it starts to erode that relationship. And so I agree with you. I feel. People often ask me, doesn't journalism have a bias toward, in favor of liberals, or of course there's going to be a few people out there who feel the opposite. And I say, no, it's really, journalism has a bias toward conflict, and that's where the bias is. You sort of said it before. And I agree with you that we have to look a little bit more at solutions. But if you look at actually the data, there is actually encouraging data that suggests that readers actually want to see solutions-based journalism, or solutions-oriented journalism. The Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, which actually, full disclosure, owned by Gannett, which owns USA Today, my employer, they did an interesting pivot just a couple years ago where they said, we're actually going to pivot away from sort of the more hot take type of op-ed style journalism, or opinion-based articles, and toward more solutions-based articles. And what they saw was a significant increase in their traffic, which suggests to me, the world has enough opinions. We have enough hot takes. It doesn't really need more of that. And so that's sort of the journey that I took on this. I know your journey is pretty similar, Amanda. So my first question for you is actually something interesting that you noticed that clicked with me, because I've been there, was in the book you talk about the tar pits in Los Angeles and this natural asphalt that's bubbling up through the surface. And I visited just about 5 years ago. I had the chance to see that. It was really cool. And I had no idea it existed. But somehow you were able to draw some interesting insights from that, and you thread it throughout the book, and to apply to the concept that you write about in the high conflict. Maybe you could talk about what you did there and why you saw that insight.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad that you actually have seen the La Brea tar pit. So it's this place right off Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, down the street from an International House of Pancakes. And scientists have found more than 3 million bones trapped in the depths of these pits. And it just looks like a sort of a small, dark lake. Doesn't look particularly special, but inside there, buried underneath, they've found skeletons of more than 2,000 saber-toothed tigers. And it's like this bizarre place that is a great metaphor, actually, for dysfunctional conflict. So what they think happened is that it's a natural asphalt spring, essentially. And it's been around since the last ice age. And tens of thousands of years ago, a large mammal like a bison must have lumbered into the tar pits. And it only took a couple inches of this sludge to immobilize even a really large animal. So the animal would start sort of grunting in distress, which would then attract predators like wolves who would come in a pack, delighted to find this prey just stuck there. And then they, of course, would get stuck. And then more animals would come and get stuck. And eventually each carcass would sort of sink out of sight. So high conflict operates just like this. It's a trap. It draws us in for totally understandable reasons. And then once you're in, it's really hard to get out. And it tends to get more crowded each day. So yeah, that's something I think about a lot, is like, how do you resist falling into the tar pits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, you also talk about the sort of the fact that demonization of other people kind of provides you purpose. I thought that was a really interesting perspective, and that you had this sort of idea that it gives you meaning, that if you're fighting evil and you sort of stay immersed in those tar pits, that to me said a lot.
There's a paradox of high conflict, which is that you want to get out and you want to stay in. Like there's something very satisfying about feeling like you are right and the other side is wrong and evil. And there's great camaraderie that can come of that, right? A sense of solidarity. It can be very satisfying. The problem is you are slowly sinking. And that is exactly what happens in high conflict, is that eventually you start destroying the thing you hold most dear, usually without realizing it. So the environmental activists who went into the fight that I wrote about to make the world a more fair and just place ended up working in the opposite direction without realizing it for quite a while. The politician who wanted to make politics less toxic and more inclusive made it more toxic and less inclusive at first. So some of this is just realizing the cost that you're paying. And sometimes that's very hard to notice. So I think that's maybe part of our jobs, right, as journalists, to surface that. I guess I wonder, one of the things that I noticed is that, we both actually, this is, I love that you open the book with Braver Angels. That is one of the organizations I went to earliest on to try to understand what's going on with the conflict. And I thought you did a beautiful job explaining how they use, the sort of lessons from marital therapy and conflict. And there's really a huge amount of overlap between the political polarization and marital conflict. Yeah. And I guess I wonder, how did you first discover them? Did you go and observe one of their workshops? Did you participate? Were you on the outside? And what was that like just for you internally?
Yeah. Honestly, I don't even remember how I first learned of them. That's a good question. It's kind of like you start reporting on this and you quickly bump into all the major players. And I'm sure that's probably how I found out about them. Because it was the pandemic, I couldn't go because I didn't really find out, dig deep into them into more the second half of reporting this. That was when the pandemic had kind of hit. I didn't get to go in person, but was able to sort of see online. They actually had online observations and online activities, which is when actually their membership exploded, was once the pandemic started. They actually tripled their membership in 2020. But this is a group that basically is trying to teach people how to talk to each other again. It's like, that's how bad things have gotten, that we as Americans can't have conversations with each other. And, if you look differently, if you think differently, if you pray differently, then I don't want to have a conversation with you because you're not in my camp. And so they're not accepting that. And Braver Angels is trying to kind of walk people through that process, which I find to be really dynamic. But in the conversation with David Blankenhorn, who's one of the co-founders of Braver Angels, I talked to him about, isn't the goal here to sort of come to some sort of consensus or some sort of centrist outcome or something like that? And he said, not at all. He said, the goal is not to get people to agree. And that kind of is sort of the fundamental premise of my book, that when you're building bridges between other people, the goal is not necessarily to come to some sort of consensus. Agreement is not the goal of Braver Angels. The goal is to reestablish some sense of social trust, some sort of this degree of investment in each other as humans, that I care about you because of your basic humanity, not necessarily because you agree with me, but because you deserve respect and you deserve, you deserve me to actually care about your future. And I thought that was so interesting that he said, I actually don't care if people agree on the issues. And he even said, I don't necessarily even care if they agree on the facts. Now that I thought was interesting, because now that's a little bit more controversial, but he says there's room for perspective. We understand that. And we're not going to get everyone to agree on all the facts. It'd be nice to get people to agree on most of the facts. But the idea that social trust is what we're pursuing, I couldn't agree more with him, because conversation, he says, is the archstone of democracy. Like, we don't have a democracy without it. We don't have a democracy without conflict. And you write about this, of course, throughout your book, the fact that democracy does not exist without conflict. If we didn't have it, it would be an authoritarian sort of system. That's when you don't have conflict, and that we don't want. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I don't want to steal your metaphor, but you talk a little bit about how fire can, friction creates fire, and fire, can actually be a good thing or a bad thing. And I think that's such an interesting comparison. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, really quickly before we
Yeah.
move on to fire, I wonder, like, I was struck by the fact that their membership, I didn't know that it had increased so much since the
Yeah.
pandemic. To what do you attribute that? I mean, that's actually quite a sizable increase.
I think there was three factors. The pandemic just caused people to look for other ways to connect with others, and I think that,
Okay, so
especially in the early
isolation.
going, yeah, I think that was it. But I think the George Floyd murder, I think, was also a real catalyst, because people realized, many people, especially white people, of course, like myself, realized for the first time that they've been disengaged from a conversation or uninterested in a conversation about the legacy of slavery or the legacy of Jim Crow and racism in America, and how we need to engage and do something about it. And so I think that that was significant. And then I think thirdly, the election just supercharged the whole thing. So yeah, their membership tripled in 2020, which is encouraging to see. We can't send everyone in America to Braver Angels workshops, but it is an interesting little anecdote of how there are people who are trying to actually learn how to talk to each other again.
Yeah, and did they not have virtual events before then, or?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think they
They were
did.
typically in person, right?
Yeah, they were
Mostly,
typically
yeah.
in person. Yeah, and then they would, for example, put a whole group of people from one side of the fence on an issue into a circle, and then you basically put the other side around them in a circle. You don't let them talk to each other at the beginning. You know, it's very interesting how they go about it, and it works. I mean, they modeled it on world-class couples counseling, basically, and you're right. I mean, it's like America's one big dysfunctional family, and if we're not getting along, we're not having conversations with each other, then we're going to be fundamentally broken as a nation, and we can't address the things that ail us. So,
right. And I wanted to sort of just pause just for a few more minutes on Braver Angels, particularly because we got a nice question here from Caleb, who's watching, and said that I've long felt it's very easy to hate a group of people, but very difficult to hate a person. How can we go about building intentional relationships with people different from us? And I think that's, there's a ton of research. The technical term for this is contact theory, right? That shows that there's been, experiments, 500 experiments all around the world that have shown, to your point, Caleb, that when people are exposed to each other under certain conditions, which is an important caveat, it has to be done with care, as Braver Angels typically does. Then they do tend to walk away less prejudiced. It's just harder to caricature someone when you know them as, you can still profoundly disagree, and people do in Braver Angels workshops, but it is an interesting experience, and it again is gonna self-select for people who are already maybe a little more open-minded. But it's an important part of any attempt, I think, to work on polarization in the country. So to get to this question of fire, I mean, I think one of the problems we have is that, and you talk about this in your book, is people mistake understanding for agreement. I'm not sure how that happened. Is it because of the media environment? Is it because of crossfire? Is it because they were already in so much conflict? So when you feel threatened, it's really hard to be curious. They tend to be mutually exclusive. But one of the things I've learned a lot about is this distinction. I've now seen people, including in Braver Angels workshops, but all kinds of situations, I have seen people really come alive with curiosity about people they know almost nothing about and have very little in common, in that sort of safe container where there's like rules of engagement and dignity and listening. And it is actually like a drug, almost. Like when people once they experience that sense of understanding, they want more. And they don't change their mind necessarily. They change their minds on some things usually, but not everything. But they want more of that feeling of being fully open and alive, even as they disagree, and retaining their own dignity, like their own sense of decency. And I think that's sort of underappreciated, like how that feels. It's a very transcendent feeling, and people tend to want more of it once they experience it. So with conflict, I think of it a lot like fire, right? Fire is an incredible, powerful force, right? It can keep you warm, it can cook your food, it's magical to watch, right? It is kind of magnetic to look at, but you have to control it. And if you don't control it, you can burn down the whole house, right? So high conflict is like an uncontrolled wildfire. You will destroy the things you hold dear. Whereas good conflict is still, there can be stress and friction and discomfort for sure, right? Still, people can profoundly disagree and experience intense anger and frustration and sadness, but they tend to cycle through, in the research, they cycle through more emotions, not just those, So there's flashes of curiosity, of understanding, of humor, and then back to frustration and anger, right? And that's where we see more questions get asked on average in good conflict. People leave the conversation more satisfied, even if they don't resolve the conflict. So for me, thinking about it like, a controlled burn is sort of where we want to get to. We don't want to have no conflict, as you, concluded as well, right?
Yeah, it's a refiner's fire. And I think, that's exactly the right way to look at it. And I couldn't agree more that people often just want to be seen. They want you to prove that you are aware of them and that you're invested in their story. I have a line here from your book where you say, once we feel understood, we see options we couldn't see before. And the way I put it is, we live in a speak first, listen second culture. But what bridge builders do is listen first and speak second, And I think when we actually are intentionally listening to Caleb's question, if you almost just sort of force yourself to not say anything and just listen for a while and actually do this, do active listening. And I was going to ask you about this because you had a very interesting experience in your book where you write about the power of looping and how you personally experienced looping and how that can help you connect with other people. Maybe you could talk about that. Oh, you're on mute.
It wouldn't be a Zoom event if someone didn't get on mute. Sorry that it had me. But I was actually, my next question for you was how you have, if this experience has changed anything about your own sort of process of interviewing people, of writing about controversial issues. And so for me, I thought I was pretty good at interviewing people. I've been doing it for 20 years at Time Magazine and The Atlantic and other places. And I got schooled pretty quickly in mediation training that most people are not very good at listening, and most people do not feel heard as a result. And it turns out, to your point, it's like the key to the kingdom. Like 50% of what people want and need is to feel heard and understood. It's not everything, right? But it is like a game of chicken, like which side's going to listen first. And then once people feel heard, they open up to information they maybe don't want to hear. They say less extreme things. Some great research by Guy Itchikoff on this. There's lots of evidence that people are more likely to follow their doctor's orders if they feel like their doctor is hearing them. And the way to make people feel heard is not just to listen and nod your head like I'm doing now, but also to actually articulate what they said in the most elegant language you can muster and play it back to them and check if you got it right. So now this is something I do in every interview, in most of my conversations that involve any emotion of any kind with friends or family. It's particularly useful in parenting for those parents out there because there's this natural urge to want to argue or solve a problem. If you've ever dealt with a toddler or a small child, they're happy to argue all day. Like they got nothing but time, right? So if you take the bait on that, it's a nightmare. So you have to just be like, wow, you're really angry that you have to go to bed. Is that right? And it's amazing. Like they're like, yeah, and then they go to bed. So
see, I feel like chocolate or something could maybe solve that. Maybe it's a little candy. Candy could solve your problem.
Same idea. Same idea. Not different. Chocolate, listening. There's no difference. I bet there's a brain scan study that's been done, and it lights up the same part of the brain.
Yeah.
So what about you? Has anything changed how you do interviews or how you think about writing about conflict?
I think the thing that's changed the most for me is trying to be more intentional about not falling back into the urge to just exclusively write about the conflict in a story, so you try to elevate, as a reporter for USA Today, I have a big platform and I'm trying, and you've of course written for The Atlantic and other places, trying to be really intentional about how I structure stories and the questions I ask, and trying to drive toward solutions, and you have to highlight the conflict. And again, conflict is okay, but trying to also drive toward that solution is really what is really the approach that I've taken. So I want to pivot. I want to talk, maybe if it's okay with you, a little bit about probably the most common question I think I get. Maybe it's the most common question you get as well, which is, how do we deal with this when people can't agree on the facts? When we're immersed in misinformation. That's what my second book was about. Honestly, I walked away from it pretty depressed. So I'm not to throw my second book under the bus, but if you want to be depressed, you can go and buy that. But no, I mean, I think that, that we have to have this conversation because it is extraordinarily challenging. I mean, it really is. I've written about QAnon, and it's extremely serious issue. But you brought up something that was a little lighthearted in your book, and it was about this phenomenon of the dress, which was this social media thing that went viral throughout the world a couple years ago. You may have seen it, those of you out there watching, which is basically this dress which people viewed as one color or the other. And there's just once you saw it as one color, you couldn't be convinced that it was the other color. You could not possibly see it as the other color. What can we learn from that phenomenon?
Yeah, that was a wild example of where we are today. And it was great because there's no stakes, there's no consequence. Like nobody, right. No elections or democracies hinged on what color that dress was. But it does go to show you that there is only perception. That's just the sad, painful reality. I think, I'm not sure, but I'm picking up on maybe part of the reason it was so demoralizing to write about misinformation and disinformation is because it goes directly counter to the identity of a journalist.
Yeah.
Like our whole point, our whole reason for telling ourselves we matter, which, maybe we don't, that's fine. But like the whole story we tell ourselves was, oh, I'm going to work until midnight and fact check and do all this reporting and try to, and the whole reason was because we think facts matter. And if you just lay them out in ways people can remember and understand, it will matter. We will matter. And again, like everyone, we want to be heard. We want to matter. So I think it's been a huge challenge personally for me to let go of some of that. And I still struggle with it. But I think even putting aside our political polarization, I think I had long valued the idea that I could just lay out the facts and make them look pretty and polish them up, and everyone would see the light, So Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, was for me hugely eye-opening on this years ago, and it's even more relevant now in some ways. But he basically writes about how when it comes to anything that touches on anything with any sort of political or moral connotation, we make decisions based on our intuition, and then we use facts to justify that gut reaction, right? And there's like 6 moral foundations, like caring and fairness and loyalty, and those are the things that really matter, right? So I think for me, one way to be useful, given this morass that we're in, is to try to get at those things, the things underneath, Why is it we are seeing the dress so differently? So there was a paper published about this. I'll try to pull up the name because it's like literally the most boring academic title.
I've never seen a boring academic paper. I don't know what you're talking about.
It was like truly shocking, but it was really interesting once you got past that to see, what were the actual reasons in our eyes and our brains and the disconnect between them, and why did some people see blue and some people didn't? And it was fascinating. So that's a sort of, fairly straightforward example of the science, right, of color perception. But that's really helpful. And it doesn't force us to abandon our perception, which we're not going to do. Like, I'm going to say it's blue. But trying to get at, why are people trusting different sources of news and distrusting others? When did that start? What are the exceptions to that? What are the examples of change over time? Like, for example, I think there's been way too little focus on talk radio and way more focus on social media, right? And understanding our polarization. But there's a lot of different things that led us to a place where there's just not enough trust. So until we can create or reform at least one national news organization that does rigorous reporting and is trusted by a plurality or a majority of both political sides, we are going to be living in alternate realities. And that is a very dangerous place to be. So I think that is one that I struggle with a lot, but I try to just keep reminding myself that trust precedes facts. And that's what Blankenhorn told you, right? From Braver Angels. I did find the title of that dress, just to close the loop of that article. It's Illumination Assumptions Account for Individual Differences in the Perceptual Interpretation of a Profoundly Ambiguous Stimulus in the Color Domain. The dress.
Okay.
So now you know.
Perspective does matter. I mean, I think that, it is important for us to say there are some facts that are just true and there is no room for perspective. I mean, there are some things where Donald Trump lost the election, that's a fact. And there is no room for perspective on that.
It's important to say it, but it won't change anyone's mind.
Right, exactly. So the question though is, how do we address the fact that there are going to be cases where there is a little room for perspective, but people don't see it that way? And the analogy that I've really come onto, this is not in the book, so hey, take it for what it is, but is this idea of a stadium analogy. If you and I are watching a game in a stadium or an arena, and I'm on one side of the arena and I see a play unfold on the field and it's a controversial outcome, the referee makes a call and it looks to me like the referee made the wrong call, let's say, and I saw the play from my angle. Maybe it's the receiver steps on the boundary and it looks like he or she or whoever, whatever sport, you pick the sport, was in bounds or out of bounds. Well, to me, it looks like the facts are clear and I can't see it any other way. But every other person in that stadium has a slightly different perspective on the play than I do. And I find that to be so dynamic. And so what I think the bridge builders would do is to say, you need to go to the other side of the stadium and sit next to the person who sees the play from their side, and then look at it from their vantage point. Now, you may see, the play unfolded exactly as I thought it did, or you may see a new perspective that illuminates your own. I mean, how many times you've been watching the game and then you see the replay and you say, oh, actually, I was wrong. So you do need perspective, and
not very often. I'm always right.
Right. Well, actually, okay, you've got something in your book here. I wrote this down. It says, quote from Gary Friedman, who says, in very few conflicts is one side totally right, on the other side completely wrong. Now, I feel like I'm always right when I'm in an argument with my wife, so I don't know what you're talking about, but
no, I love the stadium analogy, and it's good on multiple levels. Like, I think it's true that if you sat next to them, you might see it differently, but I also think that your allegiance to one team or the other is probably more important in your perception than what you see with your eyes. Yes. I also think it would be helpful to tailgate with the other people before the game, so even that better. You start to see, like I remember going to a Braver Angels workshop just as an observer, as a journalist, and there were a couple guys there who I just really disagree with. I tend to lean left, not on everything, won't surprise anyone, but that's the truth. And I came into this as a reporter, like I wasn't participating. I was trying to be, dispassionate, and these two guys were in the red team, right? They were conservative. And they were just really funny. Like they had a good sense of humor, and they were just entertaining to listen to. So even though I continued to disagree with them on some pretty big issues, I found myself really liking them. And I've now seen other people do this, and they will literally say to me, yeah, the weirdest thing is I kind of like this person. So weird. And it's almost a strange sensation that you feel it before you notice it. And then you're like, what is that feeling? Oh, it's like, I like these guys and I disagree with them. So that's that transcendent thing I was talking about. So I think tailgating would be good under the right conditions, right? But I also think there's just a lot of evidence that if it's your team, you're going to see what you want to see. So what's the solution? Well, then you need referees that you trust. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There need to be rules of engagement. There needs to be, like, if the referee says it's offside in the soccer game. Yeah. Like, there can't be a riot. And that's where we're at. We don't have referees that we trust. Michael Lewis did a great sort of podcast series on this problem a couple of years ago, which I highly recommend, which gets into the decline of referees in all parts of life, like in judges, I mean, news media outlets, if none of them are trusted,
yeah,
then you get into this world of chaos where the only thing that wins the day is power. And that is the risk, with a leader like Donald Trump, is, he's undermined so many of our institutions that you can end up in a place where charismatic, personalities with power win the day. So I think rebuilding, that's kind of the $1 million question. How do we rebuild trust in referees? How do we develop new referees? How do we have norms on social media, norms for how we fight? How do we create new media outlets that we trust? Without that, I don't see another. Trust is it's like an order of operations problem, right? I mean, What do you think?
Well, no, I agree. And the idea of referees is very interesting. And it to me, it comes back to the question of what role can and should the news media play. I think, 40 years ago, Walter Cronkite was the referee for America in a way. And so when he said Vietnam War had been lost, then people said, well, it must have been lost. And, I think that we certainly are lacking that. Now, we're not going back to some sort of environment in which a few outlets and a few, unfortunately, white men controlled the narrative of what was, distributed, the information that was validated and distributed throughout the country. But I do think that we have to start to rethink the way that our media ecosystem is set up. Now, Brian Cox has a question. Brian, a good friend, says, is it true that in the political and media spheres, particularly cable news, discord is seen as more profitable than accord? I like that, the way it rhymes. And if so, what can be done to shift that imbalance? So I'll share a thought on that, because I had an opportunity to meet with an organization called 100 Days in Appalachia. This is a group I profiled in the book, and they are doing grassroots local nonprofit journalism throughout Appalachia, based in Morgantown, West Virginia. And so I go to their multimedia center in Morgantown, thinking I'm going to, as some elite national journalist, thinking he's going to end up in some decrepit town in some decrepit building. It's this beautiful, state-of-the-art facility. But then I walk up to the 6th floor and I look out the window, and there's a smokestack right out the window. And I think to myself, oh, I should lead the chapter with this. It's the imagery, it's perfect. And then later I realized, no, that's the problem, is that national journalists oftentimes parachute into places like this and create imagery that they're seeking, and it ultimately paints people in this very caricatured portrait. But bridge builders choose nuance over caricature. And I think that bridge builders are certainly operating 100 Days in Appalachia, and the perspective that they have is that we can't lean on social media to tell the stories. They're not taking assignments from Google Trends or, our Facebook trends or Twitter, certainly not trending topics on Twitter. They're trying to tell authentic stories about the people of Appalachia and saying, listen, we have all kinds of problems. We have poverty. We have all but gone coal mining industry, but we also have diversity. We have LGBTQ people. We have Muslim people. We have people who have an ambiguous or sort of ambivalent perspective about Donald Trump. This isn't exclusively, sort of red meat territory. And I found it to be such an interesting perspective. So to Brian's question, my perspective is that we need to do a much better job about investing in on-the-ground relationships between local journalists and their communities, because I believe, and Brian and I having gone back in local journalism years ago, that the lack of, or the disintegration of relationships between local journalists and their communities is one of the main factors in the distrust that we see, the crisis of distrust between journalism and the public. Because if people don't know someone in the media, how can we expect them to trust the media? And so the encouraging thing is that we are seeing foundations and nonprofits throughout the country starting to invest a lot in nonprofit local journalism that doesn't need to have digital advertising foot the bills. They're able to then tell authentic stories and start to re-stitch together these bonds of trust that have been evaporated over time. So I don't think this is something we can fix overnight, but I do think that there are some roadmaps that can get us there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in high conflict, just more conflict is cliche, right? So to your point, I think people are hungry for something different. And we're starting to see some evidence accumulating proving that that's true. So to Brian's question about like, how can you all tip that balance, because Discord is so profitable and easy, I mean, I think that's the other piece of it. It's just much easier for newsrooms to create.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're starting to see, so Smith Geiger just did a study that was commissioned by the Solutions Journalism Network, kind of to your point about the Milwaukee newspaper, where they, but in this case, it was local TV news stories, where they did a sort of side-by-side comparison with pretty significant size sample and asked them which story was more engaging, which one would they watch all the way through. They actually studied them doing it. And what they found is that people across age, race, and political persuasion chose the solution stories over the traditional conflict story, and they stuck with it longer. So this gets back to our earlier point, right? That people are really interested in examples of communities trying to solve problems. And interestingly, they told the researchers that they didn't actually care about problems that were far away. Like, how there's often like, they'll tell you about some like terrible bus accident or shooting that happened very far from you, even though it's supposedly the local news. They didn't want to hear that, the audiences, but they were interested in attempts at solutions that were far away. So it offers also an opportunity for sort of syndicated or licensed, good stories that are about attempts to solve problems, even if they're not in your town. And I do think that the most innovative responses to this trust problem in the media are happening at the local level for sure.
Yeah.
I just wrote a piece for The Atlantic about some efforts in local TV news to rebuild some of this trust by listening to audiences like deeply. So that's probably the most exciting space, even though it's also the most malignant media format in a lot of ways, right? Like this is part of how we got here with sensationalist, fear-mongering local TV news. So it's a diabolical bit of irony, but yeah, I mean, I do think this stuff is hard. So I want to echo what you said. It's not going to be fixed overnight, but I think the financial problem, the business model of particularly print journalism is only like half the problem. It's a big problem, but the conventions of the newsroom are also a problem. The lack of conservative reporters in pretty much any place I write for is a big problem. The lack of concern about that is a big problem. The lack of conservative readers in these for national news outlets is a big problem. So as the conflict gets tighter and tighter, you see how journalists end up making it worse because they don't want to have a conservative voice at their newspaper. They don't want to have a Twitter storm. They don't want to have get canceled. And these are hard problems. I don't want to suggest they're not, but it is really past time for some serious soul searching in some of the, particularly the national news media outlets, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree more. Yeah. And I mean, I in your book, you say, I've got the line here, you say that the enemy is often caricatured. It's easier to dismiss and to demean a cartoon villain. And I think a lot of times those of us in the media have created cartoonish villains, and that to me is central to the crisis. And so how do we paint those authentic portraits? I do think it starts with, with editing decisions, story assignments, absolutely. But I will say one thing about the financial model that I do think is somewhat encouraging is what we're seeing in the last probably 18 to 24 months is that a lot of local newspapers are starting to get some momentum with regard to digital subscriptions. And, not to sing the praises of my own company, but Gannett is really starting to show a lot of momentum on that front. Very encouraging to see. And
cool.
it does suggest that we may have started to identify a solution. And why do I call it a solution? And it's because I think if we're not quite as invested in the need to just maximize traffic, exclusively just driving up page views for the sake of digital advertising, which is what is basically all that's been there online for the last several years, then we can invest a little bit more in some of the stories that might serve a public good. I mean, I think about myself when I was 17 years old. I joined the Saline Reporter in Saline, Michigan, my hometown. I'm just a kid sitting there, and the editor sends me to the Lodi Township Board of Trustees meeting, and I'm like trying to sort out what is this debate going on between septic system zoning requirements. I have no clue what's going on. I don't know why they trusted me, but the point is that I was there, that like over time I covered it for 5 years and throughout college, and like ended up establishing relationships with the trustees and people in the community. And they knew I was there as someone that they could trust as a journalist, even though I still wrote about all the things that were going wrong in the community. And I think that type of relationship, I had no idea what people were searching for, what kind of headline, how my headlines should be optimized. And I'm not putting down like SEO optimization. Like I feel like I'm actually pretty good at it. So, hopefully that skill remains relevant. But the point is that I think we would probably do a little bit better for society if we trend a little bit more toward where people are invested in the stories financially. And that way we don't have to necessarily chase after eyeballs.
Yeah. And that goes back to this point about relationships and trust, right? Like if our outlets were more trusted in a given community, then people are more likely to subscribe, right? Which then creates a little bit more buffer to do the kinds of stories that you're talking about. But I wonder, I'm curious, like in doing that kind of reporting, how much did it also matter that you could run into these people at the store? Like it's different than being a national reporter.
Yeah.
Do you think?
I think it makes a big difference. Yeah. And I think that's why national outlets actually need to do much more collaboration with local outlets. And that's why 100 Days in Appalachia is actually providing their content to organizations like The Guardian and Slate to basically say, here's our content. We are on the ground. We have the relationships. We can tell these stories in the right way. And you can trust us as journalists. Like we know journalism, you can trust us. We're not hicks, in small town America. Like we're doing real good journalism. And so I think that is one way to start doing it. So we got about 10 minutes left. Is there any other questions? If anyone's out there wants to ask any questions, go ahead. I want to ask about.
I got a question for you. Can I ask you something?
Right. Okay, sure.
Okay, so this bridge building, I think you do a good job of explaining in the book that it's actually kind of a science. Like it's not. You don't want to try it at home, like having random people who dramatically disagree. You need to do it thoughtfully. And I'm just wondering, I'm curious, did you ever witness a bridge building program that kind of went sideways in your reporting?
Wow. Interesting. I've certainly...
You don't have to name names.
Yeah,
Just saying, like, it doesn't always go like the way, it's hard.
Yeah, let me say this. I think that the bridge building efforts that focus exclusively on civility tend to go awry. Where like the whole goal is that we're just nice to each other. That's not really the right goal. And civility is an honorable objective. It's something we should shoot for. Like there's nothing wrong with that. Like it's a good thing. But that can't be the sole purpose of our pursuit. And, because there are some things that it's worth getting angry over, but I do think that that bridge builders draw a distinction between sort of anger and shame. You know what I mean? Like you can be angry, and you talk a little bit about this too. Like when you're shaming, I think the word you use is humiliating somebody, then that's just going to produce a counterproductive response. They're not going to engage with you. And in the end, you're worse off for it anyway. So what was the point? Maybe you could share some thoughts on that.
Yeah. There's like a side-by-side of emotions that Aaron Halpern in Israel does really good research on the conflict there and elsewhere about different emotions in conflict. And certain emotions like anger are great, like because anger suggests you want the other person to be better. Like you still like aspire for them to be better. Hatred and contempt are much harder to work with, right? Yeah. The same with disgust and humiliation. So humiliation, Evelyn Lindner, the psychologist who studies conflict and war, she said that humiliation is the nuclear bomb of the emotions. And I think that's right. If you look at a lot of conflict, whether it's domestic violence or gang violence or even, international diplomatic crises, often humiliation is driving that conflict. And it's very tricky, right? Because humiliation is not objective. So I could be humiliated by something that's small that happens that you would not experience as humiliation, right? And so it's easy for conflict entrepreneurs, for politicians in particular, to manipulate events and frame them as humiliating in order to sort of ignite high conflict. But yeah, I think, those are the ones you want to watch out for and avoid at all costs, even if only to avoid making your enemy stronger, like humiliation, contempt, disgust.
Right. Yeah. And you do a good job in your book of articulating how in a warlike setting, people feel justified about destroying the other side. Like if it is a war, then we feel justified. And, we've seen misinformation be weaponized, on a national or international scale. And my response to that is weaponization leads to a war. So the question is, how do we de-escalate from the war? Not how do we make things worse by just piling on and then just, basically trying to embarrass the other side. I had an opportunity for the book to attend to a group called Coming to the Table, which is trying to bring people together for a conversation over the legacy of slavery. Black Americans, white Americans, everybody really just to talk about how this continues to resonate. And obviously that right there is a controversial statement among some people who data shows don't agree that it continues to be a problem, which the fact is that it is. That's a fact. That's not an opinion. But it was such an interesting conversation with Jane, and I asked her about the idea that we should start calling out people, the call out culture, a phrase that I didn't even put in my book because I just think it's such a controversial phrase. But she said, we don't talk about it as if we're calling people out. We talk about it as if we're calling them in the sense that we're going to have the hard conversation. We're going to discuss what separates us, what divides us. But instead of calling you out for the sake of embarrassing you or shaming you, we're going to call you into the conversation and say, let me show you how what you said is hurtful to me or hurtful to someone else, or how it's wrong. And let me show you my perspective. To me, it comes down to shoulder relationships, not face-to-face, where if you and I are face-to-face, then we're in a much more confrontational posture. But if I'm shoulder to shoulder with you, we can say, take a walk together or sit together and say, I'll show you what the world looks like from my perspective. Coming down back to that stadium analogy, here's what the play looked like from where I sit. And if you listen to somebody, even if you still think they're totally wrong, then what happens is then they actually end up being more likely to listen to you. And I think that is the dichotomy that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, and I think, you also make the point in your book that it helps if when you're calling people in and having those hard conversations, you're also trying to solve a problem together in your community, like trying to take action of some kind. So there's like these ingredients that tend to make that seem to have a sort of magic effect that we want it to have. But I think with calling people out, it can feel good. It can also signal to other people that you have their back, right?
Yeah.
Who are vulnerable. And it sort of depends on the situation. And I just would urge people to know the cost, like be aware of the cost.
Yeah.
You're basically every time you do that, you're basically, purchasing office space for your adversary and like setting them up for life. Like you have basically fueled further entrenchment and toxicity, almost certainly, just because of the way humans are wired, even if it's not right. Nelson Mandela has this great quote: there's nobody more dangerous than one who has been humiliated, even if you humiliate him rightly. So, it's important to fight smart, right? To be aware of what you're signing up for when you cancel people or call them out or shame them.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know if you read Valerie Kaur's book, See No Stranger. It's just a really compelling memoir, but she's a Sikh civil rights activist who really rose to prominence after Donald Trump's election with a speech that went viral where she talks about how basically we are, as Dr. King said, all sort of caught together in this inescapable web of mutuality, as he put it. And the way she puts it in her book is that you are a part of me I do not yet know, in the sense that, our destinies are interwoven with each other. And that's why we need to build bridges with each other. So I think it's like there's room for selfishness in bridge building. Like there's room to say, I have something I want. There's an objective. Like maybe that's a policy. Maybe it's like you want action on climate change or something like that. But if you don't engage the other side, we live in a two-party system, last I checked. And unless some sort of political revolution happens, which I don't see happening anytime soon, then we have to work together. We have to have conversations.
I like that. I just wrote down that quote. There's room for selfishness in bridge building. I actually think it's the only room there is. Like, I think people go, I think, secretly, it's the same reason people go to couples counseling. Like, people go to these bridge building programs for lots of reasons, but somewhere in there usually is the desire to show the other person that they're wrong, right? Like, they want the therapist to be like, yeah, he's crazy. You're right. And so, there is that selfish interest in there. And also because it's just, you're going to be much more effective at fighting for your cause, whatever it is. So I'm all for selfishness in conflict.
Yeah. So, well, if we go on too much longer, we're going to create all kinds of conflict here. So, not the good kind. Not the good kind. Maybe a final thought or two. I'll just leave you with this. So I had the opportunity to meet with a group called the Charlottesville Clergy Collective, which was founded by a man named Pastor Alvin Edwards, the head of the Mount Zion African Baptist Church in Charlottesville. They're dealing with racial reconciliation and religious reconciliation in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville in 2017. Very difficult work, and I said to him, he's a black man who's been dealing with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow for as long as he has been alive, of course, and been a minister in Charlottesville. And I asked him, how do you maintain hope? Like, how do you still believe that people can change? And he said, I have to believe that people can change, because if I don't believe that they can change, that's a belief that I can't change, and I can't accept that. And I found that to be so dynamic, to say it's not about them, it's about me in a way. If I don't believe in the other person's ability to change, then I can't either. So that's the premise of my book. It's been just a thrill to be here with you, Amanda, and I'd love to hear your final thoughts.
Thanks, Nathan. And thank you again, Amber, for hosting us. I mean, I think, that's right. That's like, there is a growth, like a sort of rejuvenation, maybe is that too cheesy of a word, that happens in these conversations, in these moments of being challenged, right? Like, that's how we get better. And the quote that I end my high conflict with is from a woman who did an exchange like this with conservatives. She's from New York City. She's very liberal. And she did this exchange, this sort of homestay in rural Michigan. And she's quite an activist progressive, but she said afterward, I wish I could appear everywhere in my life the way I felt called to appear then, present, open, able to be surprised. And I think that is something that once you experience it, you want more.
Yeah.
Thank both of you so much. I could listen to this for longer, but I know we all have other things we need to do with our evenings. I really appreciate both your books. These are topics that I swear I think about multiple times a day, trying to, between the cultural, political stuff and then the interpersonal stuff. So I appreciate all the research and all the work that went into writing both of the books. One last thing, I did add one more link here. Nathan, I don't think your book is on audio yet, but Amanda, is it?
It will be soon, I think, but not yet. Yeah.
Okay. Amanda actually read hers, which had to be quite an experience. And I'm reading it right now, and it's great. I really love the inner working of some of the other audio clips, instead of just reading the quote. So as much as I love a paper book, and that's usually what I read, this has been a great one on audio too. So drop that link in there too. And with that, Amber, we're going to wrap up. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone. Have a good night. Take care.
Yes.